Wait, what if the story you've been told about Joseph Duggar being sent away was never the full picture? And what if the real reason behind it says more about the system he grew up in than anyone ever wanted to admit? Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today's video is going to connect a lot of dots that were never really explained on screen. And I just want to be clear from the start, this is based on patterns, claims, reported accounts, and public discussions surrounding the Duggar family and the broader system they were part of. Nothing here is about hate, it's about trying to understand what was really happening behind the carefully controlled image we all saw on TV. Because if you remember watching 19 Kids and Counting, there were always moments where things didn't quite add up. One of those moments involves Joseph Duggar suddenly being sent away to something called the Alert Academy. On television, it was presented in a very clean, very polished way, a structured environment for young men, a place where they could learn discipline, emergency response skills, teamwork, leadership, and even spiritual growth. It was framed like a kind of boot camp mixed with religious development, preparing them for future careers like EMT work, aviation, or other service-based roles. But when you start looking closer at how this type of program is actually used within certain religious systems, a very different picture starts to appear. Because within the culture surrounding the IBLP teachings, programs like that are often described by former participants and observers as something much more than just training. They're sometimes used as a place where young men are sent when they're dealing with what the system calls moral failure. And that phrase is important because it doesn't always mean what people outside the system think it means. In some cases, it refers to extremely strict interpretations of behavior, thoughts, emotions, curiosity, attraction, even normal teenage development. Things that most people would consider completely ordinary growing pains can, in that environment, be treated as serious spiritual issues that require correction. That's why you may remember rules like the Nike system. Boys were expected to look down and avoid eye contact if a woman walked by, to prevent what they believed could lead to temptation. It created this constant awareness that even thoughts could be treated as something dangerous. So, when Joseph was sent away, the explanation given publicly was simple. He was growing, learning discipline, and preparing for his future. But there was also no real detailed explanation about why it happened at that exact moment, or why it felt like his presence on the show suddenly changed. And if you go back and re-watch those seasons carefully, you start noticing something else too. Joseph just isn't there much. The focus is always elsewhere, on the pregnancies, the older daughter's courtships, Josh's storyline, and family events. The younger boys often feel like they're in the background. So when Joseph disappears for a while, it almost feels like the show quickly needed a storyline to explain his absence rather than actually showing what was going on. And what makes it even more interesting is how the academy itself was described when they did show it. There are scenes where Joseph talks about being there for weeks, doing physical challenges, learning skills, and going through structured routines that combine training with spiritual reflection. Everything looks organized on the surface, purposeful, controlled. But even the way it's framed raises questions, because viewers are left wondering, why did this suddenly become part of his life story? Why was there no build-up? Why was it introduced like a solution to something we were never told about? And this is where people who have studied these systems start pointing out a pattern, because this wasn't unique to Joseph. In earlier years, similar things were observed with other members of the family, where sudden changes in appearance, behavior, or absence from filming were never fully explained, and later seemed to connect to internal family or institutional responses rather than normal life events. So when you step back, Joseph's situation starts to look less like an isolated event and more like part of a larger system of handling issues internally, quietly, and without outside awareness. Now, according to later statements and discussions that have circulated over the years, Joseph himself later mentioned that before going to the program, there had been some kind of confession or serious conversation within the family. The details were never made fully public, and different explanations have been given over time. In some accounts, it's described as teenage mistakes or curiosity. In others, it's framed as spiritual struggle or doubts. But what stands out is how consistently these situations are handled in one direction: separation, structured correction, religious reinforcement, and then reintegration back into the family image. Almost like a cycle. Send them away, fix them, bring them back, move forward. And that pattern doesn't stop with Joseph. After the academy, Joseph later attended a Bible-focused college environment, which again was presented as spiritual development and leadership preparation. But even after that, there were still social and relationship complications that surfaced later, including connections and situations involving other families in the same social circle. Some of those relationships reportedly ended with tension or disagreement, and over time, certain families distanced themselves from the Duggar circle entirely. There were even inconsistencies later pointed out by viewers and commentators, where different accounts of relationships, timelines, and personal experiences didn't fully align. All of this adds to the feeling that what was shown publicly was only part of a much more complicated reality behind the scenes. And while all of that is happening in the background, there's another layer to this entire discussion that needs to be understood. Because zooming out from Joseph specifically, what we really start to see is a broader system of control, especially when it comes to communication, accountability, and how information flows inside the family structure. And this brings us to Jim Bob Duggar and the way power has been described within that environment. Over the years, multiple accounts, especially from family members who have spoken publicly, have described a system where communication is not always open. Instead, it is filtered, controlled, and sometimes restricted entirely between certain individuals. In that type of environment, people are not encouraged to speak directly and freely. Instead, information moves through approved channels, and that alone creates a dynamic where misunderstandings, fear, and pressure can grow very easily. Because when people feel like they can't talk openly to each other, they become dependent on whoever controls the communication. And according to several claims and testimonies shared over time, that control wasn't just about communication, it also extended into finances, decisions, and public narratives. One of the most discussed examples involves situations where family members later claimed they were not properly compensated for work done on television productions, or that financial decisions were handled in ways they didn't fully understand or agree with. These are serious claims, and they became even more widely discussed when one of the daughters publicly shared her experience and even took steps to report concerns to authorities. And what followed, according to her account, was not just disagreement, but intense pressure. Pressure through communication, pressure through family involvement, pressure through emotional appeals, and pressure through repeated attempts to resolve things internally rather than externally. And this is where a pattern starts to become very clear in how this system is described by critics and former insiders. When something goes wrong, the immediate instinct is not transparency. It is containment. Keep it in-house. Fix it privately. Avoid outside systems. Avoid public exposure. And when that doesn't work, pressure escalates through other means. Family members get involved, conversations become emotional, visits increase, and the goal shifts toward getting agreement rather than resolving the actual issue. At the same time, there are also claims that financial settlements or payments sometimes appear during these conflicts, which can create further pressure to accept terms that include silence or restrictions. And that's where the idea of control through fear becomes central, because when people believe speaking out will cause harm, not just to them, but to their entire family, they are far more likely to stay silent. That's how control systems survive for long periods of time without breaking.
And in contrast to that environment, there are people who choose a completely different path. People like Amy Paul, who has been described in public discussions as someone willing to act independently, even when it involves difficult personal relationships. In one widely discussed situation, she reportedly took action involving her own family connections and also traveled long distances to support another family going through crisis. Not because of obligation, but because of principle. She is often brought up as an example of someone who steps outside the fear-based structure and chooses accountability instead of silence.
And that contrast matters, because it highlights two very different approaches, one built around protection of reputation and internal control, and another built around transparency and external accountability. And when those two worlds collide, tension is inevitable. According to various claims and discussions, when individuals like Amy act independently, it can create backlash within the wider social circle, because it challenges the idea that everything should be handled privately and quietly. But from the outside looking in, it also represents something very important, breaking the cycle of silence. Because silence is what allows systems like this to continue without challenge. And once that silence is broken, even slightly, everything starts to shift. People begin asking questions, stories begin to connect, and patterns that were once invisible start becoming harder to ignore. So when you bring it all together, Joseph's situation, the use of structured programs, the communication control, the financial and family pressure claims, and the responses to people who speak out, you start to see a much bigger picture forming. This is no longer just about one person or one event. It becomes about how power operates inside closed systems, how narratives are controlled, how behavior is corrected internally instead of addressed openly, and how difficult it becomes for individuals to separate personal loyalty from truth when the two are constantly being intertwined. And maybe the most important question this raises is not about the past, but about the present. How many situations like this still go unspoken? How many stories are still being controlled before they ever reach the outside world? And what happens when more people start refusing to stay silent? Because once that shift begins, it becomes very difficult to reverse. And that's exactly why conversations like this matter. Not to accuse, not to attack, but to look closer at systems that are usually hidden behind polished public images. So, I'll leave it here for you. After hearing all of this, do you think these were just isolated misunderstandings and normal family decisions? Or do you think it reflects something deeper happening beneath the surface? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more deep breakdowns like this, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next video.